Within textbooks, films, and legends, it's widespread that the confrontation between Western and Native American civilizations proceeded quickly. One came, saw, and conquered. But not all of you know that the last clash between the white colonialists and the native population of the United States took place in the year 1973. And just after that clash, yes, after that clash did the proud people finally come to terms with their fate, achieving for themselves what they possibly could, if not everything, but at least a lot. That is, the battle between the aliens and the masters of the Americas, starting with the invasion of the conquistadors, lasted 500 years. This is how much they wanted to oppose invaders and protect what they have. And all this time, after 1890 much less frequently, there was a capture of prisoners for various purposes, and obviously, women. Various tribes differed from each other in their treatment of the white hostages. There were generally 4 types of use of European and occasionally Asian girls who fell into their hands. But let's firstly begin with the introduction before we move on. White women and what happened to them in the New World once they got into the hands of Native American tribes. You're watching Flip Side of History. Let's continue. Who are Native Americans, and should we even call them that way? To understand why the native populations of different parts of America treated the captured girls differently, you need to know one pivotal thing. This population itself is made up of people with vastly different worldviews. And it's no wonder. For some, the gods, spirits were inherently evil and demanded cruelty from those who believed in them. For others, they are much kinder and fair. Still, some others generally sought peace and cooperation with the guests. Finally, even before the arrival of the whites, the fourth group became outcasts among their own people, namely neighboring tribes. Their only philosophy was material values and goods. And in the era of colonization, they also had a name for fire, which is fire water. And it's not a surprise that the captives were their commodity, available for various purposes, and in the most extreme case, even food. Once again, different people, different morals, and different perspectives on life. Attitude of the native populations towards women in general. It should also be taken into account that the status of any representative of the fair sex, even a Native American in different tribal societies, varied. This should also be taken into account when thinking about the fate of white-skinned beauties in different parts of the mentioned continent. For some, the New World was unpitying, and some other women, cruelly oppressed already in the Old World, on the contrary appreciated the chance that the capture gave them. As we have already mentioned above, it matters where and by whom the charmer was captured, as well as, no less important, who she was before in Europe. How white women were captured in the New World. The wars with locals consisted of battles on regular basis, from the colonizers' attacks on native settlements and vengeful raids on the towns of Caucasian colonists who were developing the southern part of the central and eastern states of the United States. The development of these lands took place by the method of obtaining rights to land in a free form. In other words, the one who claimed the right owns the land, and consequently settling on it. Now, although the European settlers moving westward were truly afraid, the thirst for gold, silver, oil, land suitable for breeding horses and subtropical crops leveled the sense of self-preservation. More often than not, civilian people were ahead of military units. Some of them went so far that the native tribes did not need to gallop anywhere for a live trophy. So to speak, the beast itself ran at the hunter. The original Americans made an instant dash on fast steeds, picked up the girls on the saddle in front of them, and were pretty much like this. Everything happened in seconds. Preference was given to young people, 9 to 14 years old. This was the age that interested the local population more. What happened to the white captives in captivity? As indicated earlier, there were 4 types of use for captives of Western origin. Among the Iroquois, Comanches, and tribes of similar culture and ideology, women or girls were turned into brutally oppressed slaves. For them, cutting wood for many hours was the most enjoyable activity compared to all sorts of others. Unlike Native American women, they had only one right, being involved in hard labor, and the disobedient were simply killed, and more so quite harshly. And the farther you got to the east, the area where locals met the whites centuries earlier, the more respectful the hosts were of those who were brought in after the raid. Based on the memoirs of the victims of such raids, the ancient inhabitants of the eastern forests and plains treated these women as their wives, mothers, sisters, and daughters. relatives could get these maidens and women back in exchange for something that was especially necessary for the clan or tribe that had taken the captives. At more late stages, the European and then the American currencies were used. The native population became full-fledged participants in market relations. In such places, the ladies also, apart from other things, had a choice. Those for whom it made sense to return to their own people patiently waited for ransom or exchange of captives. But majority who in the old world or in the dirty town of the Wild West were only disgraced and nothing else agreed to become wives of native population, cats replacing deceased relatives. They eventually got a new name, which in this environment necessarily meant something specific. Some of course were forced to have children, see next section, but this was in very different regions of the United States. The training was harsh because a white girl had to become a fully integrated member of community, and they could do a lot of things. The training was carried out by a family of guardians, people who wanted to marry their relatives to captive wives. Although there were wandering, outright sadist tribes who found themselves in way too difficult a situation because of the newcomers, and they didn't need an extra mouth into their camp. For them, white women were a commodity that could not necessarily be sold to the relatives or friends of the captive, and anyone who gave more money, or horses, guns, blankets, or fire water. Such characters could easily become one of the poor fellows in the hands of traders of humans, both from among their fellow tribesmen and from the runaway outright bastards who were on the wanted list in cities. And if there were no buyers, then they really, as in horror films, scalped the unfortunate, or even simply ate them. Yes, there were cannibals not only in South America, but even in North America. Thus, some of the captives simply returned unharmed. Others, voluntarily or by force, became mothers of new members of a certain tribe. Still, many others became slaves, often dying. And the fourth category of women turned into an eternal commodity, migrating from one trader of human souls to another. That is, exploring the either big chunk of or whole of North America through very deplorable circumstances. If a man cost either 10 blankets or a rifle with a box of cartridges, then a healthy woman was 1.5 times more expensive, since she could be an obedient servant, for instance, and a mother of newly born children. More calm tribes rarely killed female captives. They neutralized only those who could pose a real threat, and initially they never felt any threat from women. So, if being unprejudiced, there were no bad tribes. There were renegades from different societies huddled in wild heaps. These people who couldn't fit into no matter what kind of society, traders who practically lived on wheels, other native tribes, average civilians in cities, or even frontier camps, were the ones who practiced cruelty here. There is an excessive amount of drama that has been added to the relations between Europeans and the populations of Alaska and South America. Long story short, in the first case, the Alaskan natives usually never mixed, and in the second case, with the Amerindians, they only mixed a little. Who are Comanches, Apaches, Kiowas, South Cheyennes, and Arapaho? Not all native population was erased from our planet. Even in the United States, by civil strife, firearms, alcohol, smallpox-infected things, although the overwhelming majority of them, of course, disappeared. About 95 million people. The modern representatives of these named tribes are, on average, 33% European. Ever since the whites drove out full-blooded native people north of the Red River, they've been left with literally no choice. There were not enough women in their tribes for healthy existence. The tribes are artificially isolated, and marriages with relatives were not encouraged among native tribes. So these mini-nationalities simply had to steal brides of a different race, namely from the towns of what are now Texas, Louisiana, Oklahoma, and Arkansas. The Republic of Texas, which for a long time remained completely multinational and multilingual, independent, and had not yet been divided into all the above-mentioned states, was inhabited by women from different places. From Mexico, a former colony of Spain, from Spain itself, the British possessions of Europe, namely England, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Maine, from France and Germany, even from China, from Canadian and Louisiana areas with half Native Americans, formed from marriages of the very first French colonists with Native Americans. There were also people from Russia, and people among all of these groups ended up in the wigwams of the original people of Americas after the raids. The process of re-education of hostages was, in the 18th and 19th centuries, at its peak. There is the case of Olive Oatman. She was kidnapped in 1851 at the age of 14. She was released at the age of 19 and she was a real Native American woman, with mentality of not Western but presumably of a Pi woman. If you take a closer look at the modern representatives of these native peoples visiting the reservations, you will notice this. A third of the native population can be easily confused with Italians, Southern French, or Spaniards. Only during the ceremony is it possible to determine their true ethnicity by the national costume, the rest of the time only by the document. As you know, the native population of Americas have never been a single unity of people. This is nothing more than a generalized name for the indigenous population of North and South America. In fact, this is generally one continent, like Eurasia, for example, and it would be not right to assume that they are all the same or have the same views. They differed in language and language families, customs, religion, folk costume, and even in appearance from north to south. The tribes closest to each other showed only some similarities in the way of speech and the way of farming. And accordingly, the attitude of different Native Americans to white captives was vastly different. It was also divided into types. If you read the Western adventure literature of the old days, you will notice a certain fact. The passion of the Native American tribes for the capture of hostages is clearly overestimated by the authors. First of all, they stole cattle, horses, took guns, cartridges, leather boots. People were a burden. They were captured only and once again only by large groups of raiders, capable of defending and taking care of living trophies. The more the Native Americans thinned out, the less they could afford such profitable raids. The exceptions were the tribes mentioned in the last chapter, and again, they did it because they were forced to. Thank you for watching this episode. You were watching Flip Side of History. And if you liked this episode, leave a like and, of course, subscribe. Take a look at our other episodes and see you later.